Hi and welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk to you about how you can make your digital photographs and videos look like they were shot on analogue film. And this tutorial is largely in camera, so it's not so much about presets and editing in Lightroom and things you can do after you've taken a photograph. It's tactics that you can employ before you even pick up the camera, how you set up your camera so that the digital negative that comes out of your camera, the raw file, is set up to look as good as possible so that you have to do minimal editing. So first I think I need to start with a disclaimer, because with a video titled How to Make Your Photos Look Like Film, I know that there are going to be a lot of film purists out there who come in and say, well, just shoot film, just shoot 35mm, just shoot medium format, just pick up a film camera and be done, don't try and make digital look like film. Film's better, digital's inferior. There's so many arguments, and I don't want to get into that sort of polarised view of digital versus film, because I think that both formats have their place. I love shooting film, but I mostly shoot film 35mm in spring and summer. For my work, for wedding photography, I exclusively shoot digital because it's easier, and because when I'm going from a dark venue, for example a church or a ceremony room, to outside for photographs in the midday sun, because weddings always take place at the time of day which is actually most inconvenient for lighting, I need to be able to go from a very dark scene to a bright scene, to go from ISO 100 to ISO 3200 without having to carry different bodies with the different ASA, ISO films loaded. And so digital is just really good. I also live in the UK, and the UK is known for dark winters. For 6 months a year, sometimes even longer, we don't see the sun, and it's dark at 3:30, 4 o'clock. And shooting digital is just really useful because it means that you can crank the ISO up and still get a good photograph indoors in natural light without having to use flash or off-camera lighting. And so I think that digital has transformed people's workflows and is to be valued and cherished, just like analogue film can be valued and cherished for what it offers. So I really like shooting film because I like the colours and I like how soft and bright and luminous it is. There's something about a film photograph that just pulls me in and makes me feel so nostalgic, and I know that a lot of people, a lot of photographers feel exactly the same way when it comes to film photography and film photographs. So it might be that you have film photographs from your childhood that just are very evocative and that you're very fond of, and you can't quite put your finger on what it is about them, but the digital photographs you take with your DSLR or with your mobile phone, they just don't really compare in the same way. And it's not just the passing of time, it's something to do with the way the image is created. So I have been exploring ways to make my digital workflow look as close as possible to my film workflow for the past probably 8 or 9 years. It started when I really got serious about film photography. I bought an Olympus OM2N, which is a 35mm film camera, and I really got into shooting Kodak Portra 400, which is one of my favourite film stocks. But the trouble is, Kodak Portra 400 is quite expensive, so I would feel very nervous about shooting it, and I'd be quite reserved in how I shot it, and I just kept it for holidays and day trips and special occasions. But I wanted to be able to capture my everyday life and simple everyday scenes using the same sort of feel, the same emotions, the same colours, and to match my digital work to my film flow. So I started exploring, and I looked at different books and I read lots of blog posts, and I slowly came up with my method, which is what I still use to this day in my personal work and in my professional work, to make my digital photographs look as close as possible to contemporary film stocks. So I should probably start by saying, another disclaimer, what I mean by look like film. So to different photographers, looking like film means different things. To some it's a faded 1970s photograph with yellow and orange tones. To others it's something with lots of grain. To street photographers it means black and white with very high contrast. And to fine art photographers it usually means Kodak Portra 400 and Fujifilm 400H, which I think has been discontinued now, or has been in the last few months, but I might be wrong on that. My favourite film stocks are Kodak Portra 400, Kodak Portra 160 and Fujifilm 400H, although that's harder to get hold of, and of course now if it's been discontinued that's harder still. So these are the film stocks that I want to emulate, and that's the look that I'm trying to emulate. And I can show you some photographs that I've taken on digital versus some photographs I've taken on film at the same time in the same lighting, just to show you how close I have been able to match my digital photographs to my film photographs. So I suppose we should talk about technique now, and this can be separated into 4 parts. The first 2 parts are basically shoot to the right and use your ISO. And the second 2 parts are use vintage lenses and use film emulation presets. Now, film emulation presets are a post-production thing, they're not in camera, and they are the icing on the cake that you use at the end of the process rather than what you rely on. So you cannot take a photograph which is underexposed and which is dark and which was taken on a camera that doesn't have a wide sensor and make it look like it was taken on a film camera with a 50mm f1.8 lens. There's physical limitations to what you can do, but if you're using a DSLR or a mirrorless camera with interchangeable lenses, and you can use a fast lens, so for example a nifty 50, a 50mm f1.8, then you can very easily achieve this look in camera. And also I think it's really important to say that you don't need to have a full frame 35mm camera. I was doing this with an APS-C camera on an entry-level Canon camera, and I was also doing it years and years ago with an Olympus camera before it was micro four thirds, when it was just 4/3. So on I can't remember what the camera model was, but it was very, very old-fashioned digital. And it all comes down to the lenses you're using, which I will address in part 3. So in the first part, shoot to the right, I'm going to assume that as a photographer you know your exposure triangle, and if not, then in a future tutorial series I will go through the exposure triangle and explain what shutter speed and aperture and ISO will mean, so that you can get started and learn those skills. But for this tutorial I'm going to assume that you know what the exposure triangle is and you're confident and you're comfortable with it. So look at your histogram on camera. If you press the display button on the back of your camera, it will change the display and you can get a histogram overlaid across your photograph. What you want to do when you're emulating film in camera is make sure that your histogram is as far to the right as possible, so as bright as possible, without clipping the highlights, so without having blown out whites. So if you were to underexpose or use standard exposure, it might be that your image was just a little bit dark, and it will never look truly like film. You need to have as much light in there as possible. So I will show you some examples from photographs that I've got up in Lightroom, showing the different ISO settings and aperture settings that I've used. But basically what you want to do is make sure that you are using a shutter speed that is fast enough not to have handshake in your photo, an aperture that is suitable for what you want to achieve, be that shallow depth of field for lovely bokeh, or for a landscape photograph with lots of detail from the foreground to the background and some distance away. And then use your ISO, and this is the second tip. Do not be afraid to use your ISO. Many photographers think that they need to keep their ISO super low so that they don't get noise, digital noise and grain. But with a modern digital camera, so a camera that has been built any time in the past 5 to 8 years, and I still use a Canon 5D2 which is 13 years old, and I still use that for personal work and professional work because the images are great. But if you're using an APS-C camera that's built in the past 5 years, you really don't need to worry about the high ISO and noise, because it'll be reliable and it'll give you really lovely clear images. So if you have set your aperture and your shutter speed to give you the image that you want, but it's quite dark, so the exposure is much more normalised towards the centre of the histogram, just try bumping your ISO up a little bit to shift the histogram to the right and see what the image looks like. So you might want to try this with a still life, using a tripod so that you can take many different photographs one with a low ISO, one with a medium ISO and one with a high ISO, just to see what the different exposure looks like. Because these different RAW files will respond differently in post-production when you come to using your presets, and will just give you different colours and different grains and different moods. Yes, you can bump the exposure in post-production in Lightroom or in Photoshop or in whatever suite you use, but the trouble with that is that it's a digital boost as opposed to an in-camera digital boost, which is just much more nuanced and powerful than what you can get in post-production. So shoot to the right and use your ISO, and I'll show you some examples of that, but that will get you a long way. So the third part is use vintage lenses. Now this is something that I fell upon because of my work with my film camera. So I use my Olympus OM2N, and I also have a Pentax Spotmatic SP2, which is the M42 system. And I use the M42 system because the first film camera I had was a Praktica MTL3 that my dad gave me, and it's a bit like a machine gun. It's really, really loud and it shakes and it rattles, but it came with 3 lenses that he had that were all M42 screw mount. And I love these lenses, and I was just starting out on digital, and I thought, how can I get these lenses onto my digital cameras, or how can I get the equivalent lenses onto my digital cameras? And back then I was a student, and I was towards the end of my PhD, and my stipend was running out, and I didn't have a huge amount of income. So I bought second-hand film camera lenses because they're so much cheaper than digital lenses, and it just gave me the options to explore photography without having to shell out, you know, £400–500 for a lens. So I started using manual film lenses from my film cameras with adapters for EOS, for the Canon system. And they're slower, they don't have autofocus, and they've got manual aperture rings on them. But they taught me a hell of a lot about photography, about aperture, about the exposure triangle, about how to control my image. And once I finished university and I started doing photography and filmmaking professionally, I still use these manual lenses even in my professional work because I'm used to them. I'm fast with the exposure and with the focusing rings, so I can throw focus very quickly and just know where to be in range, and that comes from experience. And so it's just very comfortable to use them, and they've saved me a lot of money. So for instance, I have a Olympus OM55mm f1.2 lens, which cost me £200 in 2013. Now if I were to buy the Canon equivalent of that, the autofocus equivalent, I haven't got a recent price, but it would be close to £1,000. And the focus is known to be a bit iffy on the 50mm f1.2 Canon lens, and I can get a very quick focus on the manual focus. So I've just saved myself the money and I still use that. And if you want to get a really affordable entry to manual focus lenses, you can't go wrong with a kit lens, which is a 50mm f1.8 from any of the major camera brands from the 60s, 70s, 80s. So Canon film camera lenses are a little bit more difficult to adapt because Canon have changed their lens mount over the years. But if you use Olympus lenses with the OM mount, or if you use screw lenses with the M42 mount, which were popular with the Praktica and the Pentax cameras, and I think there are others for other camera brands as well, and you need a simple adapter ring that is designed to change the manual focus lens from your camera, from your digital camera, to fit the back of the lens. And these rings are widely available. You can get them on Amazon, you can get them on eBay. I would recommend not using Amazon because they don't pay their workers enough money, and I think it's worthwhile to support more ethical shops, so I would really encourage you not to buy them on Amazon. But eBay sellers, independent eBay sellers will sell them too. Some camera shops will. They're very affordable, you know, they might be £10, £15 or so. And then that allows you to use all sorts of manual focus lenses with your digital camera. And the beauty of these lenses is that they have lens flare and they're not perfect. And so they give you a soft hazy look, or they give you just a soft focus look with very little effort in camera. So my default camera lenses that I use these days are my OM lenses, and I also use a 50mm f1.4 by Takuma, which is like it's a very popular lens in the photography community because of just the lovely soft outer focus you get when you're shooting it wide open. And I also use a Helios 58mm f2 lens, which is also another popular sort of cult lens, which has got swirly bokeh, so when you're photographing a portrait or a still life and you've got shallow depth of field, you'll have this crazy swirly out of focus bokeh, and that's really, really good fun to play with. And they can be picked up for about £50 second-hand on eBay, because they were a mass-produced lens in the Soviet Union, and they were supplied with many cameras throughout the 80s and 90s, possibly a little bit before as well. Don't quote me on that, but the dates, they go back several decades. There's a lot of them around. There's lots of different models. My model is a 44M. I've also used the 44-2 in the past. The only thing you need to be aware of with the Helios lens is to make sure that it is compatible with your camera. So if you use a full frame Canon camera, for example the 5D2, 5D3, 5D4 or the 60 series, there can be compatibility issues with the back of the lens hitting your mirror when you're focusing at the two extremes of the focus range. But there is a website with the cameras listed that says whether there's a compatibility issue, and I will list that in the description box below, so you can check to make sure that your camera is safe to use with the Helios lens before you actually start using it. The last tip that I have is use film emulation presets. There are so many different companies and individuals offering film emulation presets. The presets I use are made by Totally Rad Replichrome. This video is not sponsored by them, I'm not affiliated with them, and I did actually pay for the presets myself many years ago. So just take it from me as a recommendation rather than because I'm being paid to say that they're good. But you can also use presets by VSCO, which are very popular. And there's a photographer called Rebecca Lilly who sells her own film emulation presets. There's so many different ones out there, and I will list some options in the box below. But what I would suggest is you find a pack and you stick with them. There's no point in buying presets by several different companies and changing between them. So just find some and try them out and get used to them. But really do focus on the first 3 tips in this tutorial, which is exposing to the right, using your ISO and trying vintage lenses. And even if you use the kit lens that comes with your DSLR or mirrorless camera, you will still go a long way by using the first 2 tips, so exposing to the right and using your ISO. It all comes down to having a bright negative as a starting point. That will get you a long way to making your digital photographs look bright, luminous, and as close to contemporary film stocks as possible. So this video, in true fashion, has been a super long one, full of lots and lots of information. I hope it hasn't been too overwhelming, but I just really wanted to share what I've learned and what I've picked up over the years. Because it can be a bit of a mystery when you're getting into photography, how to make your photos look like photos you see by a favourite photographer on Instagram, or someone you find on Flickr, or someone who's had their photographs printed in a magazine. It's such a steep learning curve, and so much of it is a mystery that photographers don't share because they see it as their secret sauce. I don't see it that way at all. I'm completely self-taught, and I taught myself everything I know by starting at the bottom and learning through online tutorials, and so it's really important to me to give back to the community and to help photographers who are perhaps a few steps behind me in terms of their years of experience to find their style and to develop technique that suits them and the subjects that they want to photograph. I think I've covered everything today. I've got notes down here just to sort of jog my memory. But I think that's it. But if not, I will put some links in the description box below. I might do another video in the future about legacy lenses and vintage lenses and show you the same scene with different vintage lenses so you can get a feel for what they can do. But yes, if you're wanting to save money and really get the film look with your digital, look at vintage lenses, look at legacy manual lenses, and even contemporary manual lenses. So my contemporary telephoto, the lens that I use to photograph the ponies in Sutton Park, which I often share on my Instagram page, is all taken with a Samyang 135mm f2 lens, and it weighs a ton, it weighs about a kilo, and it's entirely manual focus. And again, it saved me a lot of money over the Canon version of that, which is autofocus. But it suits me well for my photography and for filming as well because of the manual focus rings. So I think that's it for today. I am going to leave you there. If you've got any questions or if you have any tips of your own, please leave them in the description box below. But yes, if you're a film purist, please don't feel like I'm stepping on your toes or telling people that digital can completely replace film. That's not the case at all, but let's just celebrate digital like we celebrate film and recognise that both formats have their place in the photography world. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. Please remember to like, comment and subscribe because it really helps me build this channel and make tutorials that are hopefully calm and informative and not quite so gear focused like a lot of photography tutorials can be. And I'll see you very soon. Thank you, bye!